There is a man standing at a podium in a glass boardroom on the 23rd floor of Columbus's most expensive office building. He is in a $1,200 suit. His shoes are polished. His team is behind him. Cameras from 2 news stations are set up in the corner. The biggest real estate deal this city has seen in 20 years is sitting on the table in front of him, ready to be signed. He reaches for the pen, and the door opens. An old man walks in. Mud-caked boots, work-worn hands, a flannel shirt that has seen 100 seasons. He looks at the room like a man who has been in many rooms and knows the difference between rooms that matter and rooms that perform. He walks to the head of the table. He stops. He looks at the man with the pen. He says, "I'm afraid that is my chair you are sitting in." The room goes completely silent. Now, the title of this story says a greedy real estate agent mocked a farmer before the farmer bought the entire district. That is true. But what the title does not tell you is that this farmer is not who anyone in that room thinks he is. He is not a simple man who got lucky. He is not someone who found oil on his land by accident. He is not the wrong place, right time story that people want to put him in. He is a retired civil engineer who bought a swamp 40 years ago because he read blueprints that did not exist yet and understood what the land would be worth before a single city planner had put pen to paper. And the man who mocked him, who laughed at his boots, who tried to steal his land, who said out loud in front of witnesses that the old man was too poor and too stupid to know what his own property was worth. That man is now standing in a boardroom with a pen in his hand and no idea that the thing he is about to sign is worthless without the old man's permission. This story goes deep. It has the full history of both men. The real estate agent's rise from nothing and what it did to him. The farmer's life and what he knew and when he knew it. A love story that almost did not survive ambition. And an ending in that boardroom that is going to stay with you. Stay here. This is worth every minute. Before we begin, like this video right now, one tap. If you believe that arrogance always meets its specific correction eventually. Subscribe to Fair Folktales and ring the bell. We are here every single week. Comment below, what would you have done if you were in that boardroom? Tell us everything. Now let us go back to the beginning. His name was Julian Marsh. He grew up in Akron, Ohio, in a house that was never quite warm enough in winter because his father kept the thermostat at 62 and told everyone they were saving for the future. The saving was real. The future never quite arrived. His father worked at a paper mill for 31 years and retired with a pension that covered the basics and nothing extra and seemed, to the people around him, like a life well managed. To Julian, it looked like a life that had been accepted. He had decided, by the time he was 14, that he was not going to accept anything. This was not a cruel decision. At 14, it was just energy, the specific energy of a boy who sees a ceiling and decides the ceiling is a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be lived under. He worked weekends. He mowed lawns, shoveled drives, washed cars. He saved with the same discipline his father had used, but toward a different destination. He was not saving for the future. He was saving for the launch. He got his real estate license at 22. He was good at it immediately, not because he had any inherited knowledge of the industry, but because he was the specific kind of salesperson that real estate rewards. He could read what a client wanted before they said it. He could find the version of a property that matched the version of a life someone was trying to build. He was charming, fast, and worked hours that made his colleagues uncomfortable. In year 1, he was the top junior agent at his firm. In year 3, he opened his own agency. Marsh Properties, small office, 2 agents besides himself, focused on mid-market residential in the suburbs east of Columbus, which was where the growth was happening and where Julian had identified a specific pocket of opportunity that the larger firms had not focused on. He was right about the pocket. He was often right about these things. By year 7, Marsh Properties had 12 agents and was competing for commercial listings in central Columbus. By year 10, Julian was making money that bore no resemblance to the 62-degree house in Akron. He had a penthouse apartment. He had the car. He had the suits. He also had something that the money had quietly installed in him that he did not fully notice because it arrived gradually. He had contempt. Not for everyone. He was not a man who despised everyone he encountered, but for a specific category of person, people who, in his assessment, had not maximized their position. People who held assets they did not understand the value of. People who were comfortable in circumstances that Julian would have found intolerable. He had a word for these people in his head: stuck. And when he looked at stuck people, especially stuck people with property, he felt the specific combination of frustration and hunger that had driven him out of Akron. He felt, this is mine to unlock. These people do not know what they have. I do, therefore I should have it. This logic was not always wrong. He had done genuine deals, bought properties from people who were relieved to sell, developed them well, and created value on both sides. He had been a good agent for good clients. He had real skill. But the logic had, over 15 years, expanded to cover situations where it was not right at all. Situations where the person on the other side of the table knew exactly what they had and was simply not interested in Julian's version of its value. Those people he called stupid. He used the word casually in his own head, sometimes when he thought nobody was listening, out loud. His business partner, a careful man named Greg Hale who had been with the firm since year 2 and who kept Julian's worst instincts from the door of the conference room without Julian always knowing it, had said to him once, "Julian, be careful with the way you think about the sellers who say no. Sometimes they know something you don't." Julian had said, "In 15 years, Greg, how many of those people turned out to know something I didn't?" Greg had thought about it. "Once," he said, "that I know of." "Once in 15 years, Julian said. "Once that I know of," Greg repeated. He put emphasis on those words. Julian had not fully processed the emphasis. This was about to cost him everything. The opportunity that started all of this came to Julian's desk on a Tuesday morning in late October. It was a project brief from a development consortium called Meridian Group. They were planning the largest mixed-use development Central Ohio had seen in 30 years, a district-scale project combining residential towers, commercial space, retail, and a transit hub. The site was on the eastern edge of Columbus, in an area that had been semi-industrial and semi-agricultural for decades. The brief was direct. Meridian needed all the land parcels in the target zone secured before the project could be financed. They were engaging Julian's firm to handle the acquisition process for 12 specific parcels. Julian read the brief 4 times. He pulled up the site map. He looked at the parcels. 11 of them were owned by entities that he had existing relationships with or that he could approach through his network. Standard commercial acquisition work. The 12th was different. The 12th parcel was a 340-acre plot on the western edge of the project zone. According to the county records, it had been registered under a single owner for 41 years. The property description noted, mixed farmland and wetland. Current use, agricultural. The registered owner was a man named Walter Bream. Julian had never heard the name. He called the county assessor's office and got the current assessed value of the Bream parcel. He put the phone down. He said to Greg, who was working at his own desk across the room, "The 12th parcel is assessed at $11,000 per acre, 340 acres. He is sitting on $3.7 million in land, and I would bet you a year's salary he has no idea." Greg looked up. "Who is he?" "A farmer," Julian said. He had already looked. The tax records showed a Walter Bream listed occupation, farmer, address in Milford Township. "Retired," Greg said. "Does not say," Julian said. "How old?" Greg said. Julian looked at the records. 73. Greg said, "Julian, be careful." Julian was already calculating his commission. He drove out to Milford Township on a Wednesday morning. He wore the $1,200 suit. This was deliberate. When he dealt with people who he assessed as unsophisticated, he wore the suit because he believed it communicated authority and because authority made negotiations easier. He had his business cards. He had a preliminary offer letter. He had a folder with photographs of the Meridian Project's render, showing what the development would look like when complete. He drove past the property first. He pulled over on the county road and looked at it through the window. 340 acres of farmland and wetland. The eastern portion looked like active farmland. He could see rows, evidence of cultivation. The western portion was clearly wetland, a broad, low-lying area covered in the specific vegetation of land that was wet year-round. A swamp, essentially, though the county designation was protected wetland. He looked at the swamp and thought, useless. He drove to the farmhouse. It was a proper farmhouse, not a ruin, not a showpiece. A house that had been maintained by people who treated maintenance as a duty rather than a statement. The porch was solid. The windows were clean. There was a truck parked at the side that was old but functional. He knocked. Walter Bream opened the door. He was 73 years old, and he looked like someone who had been outdoors for most of those years in ways that were productive rather than recreational. Not frail, solid. Medium height, with the specific posture of someone whose back had been worked hard and had held up. White hair. Eyes that were a particular kind of blue-gray that Julian would later describe, though not accurately, as simple. They were not simple. Julian would understand this later. At the time, he looked at Walter Bream and put him in the category marked stuck. A man who had sat on $3.7 million in land for 40 years without doing anything with it. "Mr. Bream," Julian said. "Yes," Walter said. "My name is Julian Marsh. I am with Marsh Properties, based in Columbus. I wonder if I could have a few minutes of your time. I have some information about your property that I think you will find very interesting." Walter looked at him. He looked at the suit. He looked at the folder in Julian's hand. He said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen was what you would expect from the outside, functional, well-ordered, not decorative. There was a coffee pot on the counter. Walter poured 2 cups without asking. Julian opened the folder. He showed Walter the Meridian Group render. He explained the project, the scope, the timeline, the scale of what was being built on the eastern edge of Columbus. Walter listened. He did not ask questions during the explanation, which Julian took as confirmation of his initial assessment. The man did not know what he was looking at. When Julian finished, he said, "The 12 parcels in this zone are being acquired as part of the development. Your parcel is one of them, Mr. Bream. I am here today to make you an offer." He slid the preliminary offer letter across the table. Walter picked it up. He read it. He read it once, then again. He set it down. He said, "This is for the whole parcel, all 340 acres. "Yes," Julian said, "at the figure on that letter." Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the farmyard. Then he said, "And the wetland portion." "Included," Julian said, "all of it." Walter nodded slowly. "The figure you have here," Walter said, "is significantly below the current assessed value." Julian smiled. He had prepared for this. "Mr. Bream," he said, "with respect, the county assessment is a standard metric. It does not account for the specific characteristics of your land. The western portion of your property, the wetland, is not developable. It has no commercial utility in its current form. The figure I have offered reflects a fair price for the farmland portion, with the wetland essentially added at a minimal value." Walter looked at him. "You think the wetland has no commercial utility," he said. "In its current condition," Julian said, "no." Walter picked up his coffee. He said, "Thank you for coming out, Mr. Marsh. I'll think about it." Julian had been in enough negotiations to know this meant no, for now. He said, "Of course. I want you to have full information before you decide. I would just say the project timeline means we need the parcel agreements finalized within 90 days. If we cannot reach an agreement within that window, the project may need to work around your property, which would significantly affect the future value of your land. This was not entirely true. It was standard pressure language. He had used it many times. Walter looked at him. He said, "I appreciate the information." Julian stood. He gathered his folder. He left his card on the table. At the door, he said, "One more thing, Mr. Bream. This is a significant project. The kind of thing that transforms an area. It would be a shame to miss the opportunity because of an attachment to land that has not been fully productive for 40 years. He said the last part kindly. He thought he was being kind. Walter looked at him from the doorway. He said, "Have a safe drive, Mr. Marsh." In his car, driving back toward Columbus, Julian called Greg. "Old farmer," he said, 73, living on land that was assessed 30 years ago at nothing, offered him fair value. He will think about it. He will call. They always call. Greg said, "How did he seem?" "Simple," Julian said. "Nice enough, but not sophisticated about what he's holding." Greg was quiet for a moment. "Did you push the timeline pressure?" Greg said. "Mentioned it," Julian said, softly. Greg said, "Okay." "He will call," Julian said again. Walter Bream did not call. Subscribe if this story is already telling you something. We tell these every week. Walter Bream had not always been a farmer. He had been a civil engineer for 22 years. He had studied at Ohio State in the late 1960s on a scholarship that covered his tuition, but not his rent, which meant he had worked his way through a degree that was genuinely difficult while living in a basement room that he shared for 3 years with a man who would become his closest friend. That man was named Thomas Park. Thomas had been studying urban planning in the same building, 1 floor up. They had met at a library table at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in October of 1968 when they were both working on something overdue and both needed the last copy of the same reference book. Thomas had it. Walter had sat down across from him and said, "I'll split it with you if you let me read it in parallel." Thomas had said, "That is the most efficient thing anyone has said to me all semester." They had split the book. They had also, over the following months, split most of their meals, most of their ideas, and the specific discovery that each of them saw cities in a way that most people around them did not as places that existed but as processes, living systems, things that grew according to patterns that could be read if you knew how to look. Walter graduated in 1971 with a civil engineering degree and a specific understanding of infrastructure and drainage systems that would define his professional life. He went to work for the Ohio Department of Transportation. For the next 22 years, Walter Bream's job was to figure out where roads and water systems and drainage infrastructure could go and what would happen to the land around them when they did. He worked on projects across the state. He understood, more completely than most people in any room he entered, the relationship between land and water and what a city needed to grow. He also had access to something that most people did not have. He had access to the long-range planning documents. Not the published plans, the internal ones. The ones that existed years before public announcement, that mapped where infrastructure was going and therefore where land values were going to move. He did not use this for personal gain in any way that was improper. He was a careful, ethical man, and he understood the rules. But what he could do with the knowledge, legally and cleanly, was think. He thought a lot. He had a notebook. Engineers always had notebooks. And in it, from the early 1980s onward, he had been tracking a specific pattern. The eastern corridor of Columbus was going to grow. Not immediately. Not in 5 years. But in the long arc of urban development that he could see in the infrastructure plans and the population projections and the specific decisions being made about where major roads and utilities were going, the Eastern Corridor was the next direction. And in the Eastern Corridor, on the edge of the projected growth area, was a piece of land that everyone else considered worthless. The Milford Township wetland. 340 acres of farmland and wetland, listed in the county records as mixed agricultural and protected wetland, assessed at a value that reflected what it currently was rather than what it was going to be necessary for. Walter had looked at those records. He had looked at his internal knowledge of where the infrastructure was going. He had looked at something specific that most people missed entirely. The wetland was not a problem. The wetland was the solution. Any major development on the eastern corridor of Columbus was going to require, by federal environmental regulation, a natural filtration and water management system. You could not build a district-scale urban development without addressing stormwater management and natural filtration. The regulations were clear, and the engineering requirements were real. The Milford Township wetland was, by geography and by its natural characteristics, the optimal location for that filtration system. Whoever owned the wetland owned something that any major development in that zone could not proceed without. Walter had understood this in 1982. He had bought the land in 1983. The price he paid for 340 acres of farmland and protected wetland in Milford Township in 1983 was $48,000. This was, at the time, below market even for the land as it was assessed. He had paid below market because the county considered the wetland a liability, an area with restricted development potential that dragged down the overall value. He knew otherwise. He did not tell anyone what he knew, not because he was secretive, but because the knowledge was in the gap between his professional understanding and what was publicly available, and explaining it would have required explaining things he was not comfortable sharing from his professional position. He simply bought the land. He registered it in his name. He paid the property taxes faithfully for the next 41 years. He also, 5 years after buying it, retired from the ODOT and moved onto the property. He became a farmer. This decision confused the people around him. He was 50 years old when he retired. He had a good pension from the state. He had no mortgage. He had a career that had been respected and productive. And he moved to a farmhouse in Milford Township and started growing things. His colleague from ODOT, a man named Frank, had said at the retirement party, "Walter, the man who has spent 20 years telling us where infrastructure should go is going to go live on 300 acres with no infrastructure." Walter had smiled. He had said, "The infrastructure is coming. I'm just going to be there when it does." Frank had laughed. He thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. The woman who had been beside him through all of it was named Margaret. They had met in 1974, 3 years after Walter graduated. He had been at a public works information meeting, the kind of meeting that no one attended by choice, but that he attended because attending every piece of relevant information was who he was. She had been there because she was a community organizer who worked on housing issues, and the meeting touched on a housing development that affected her work. She had asked a question during the Q&A that was sharper than any question the professional attendees had asked. Walter had noticed. After the meeting, he had gone over and said, "That was the right question." She had looked at him. She had said, "You are the first person who has told me that in 3 meetings." "The other questions were procedural," he said. "Yours was structural. It went to the actual mechanism." She had looked at him with the expression of someone encountering a person who speaks a language she thought she was alone in. "You are an engineer," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you might be able to help me with something," she said. He had been helping her with things for the following 50 years. Margaret had not been simple about the land purchase in 1983. She had been specific about it. "You are spending $48,000 that we do not completely have," she said, at the kitchen table of their Columbus apartment, with the property documents in front of them. "Yes," he said. "Because you believe this is going to be worth much more," she said. "Yes," he said. "In how many years?" she said. "I do not know exactly," he said. 20, 30, maybe 40. She had looked at him. "You are asking me to trust a 40-year investment," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You have never been wrong about infrastructure in the 11 years I have known you." "Not significantly," he said. She said, "Okay, show me the engineering basis." He showed her. She read it the way she read everything, thoroughly, asking questions where she did not understand, taking notes. At the end, she said, "The wetland is the key." "Yes," he said. "Without the wetland's filtration capacity, the development cannot be permitted under federal environmental guidelines," she said. "Yes," he said. "So whoever owns the wetland has a legal necessity that the development cannot work around," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the documents. She looked at him. She said, "This is either the smartest thing you have ever done, or we are going to be very embarrassed in 40 years. "I am aware of both possibilities," he said. She picked up the pen. She said, "Let us do this together." Both their names had been on the deed since 1983. Margaret had died 4 years before Julian Marsh knocked on the farmhouse door. She had died in her sleep, in the farmhouse, in the winter, in the way that people who have lived completely sometimes go, without drama, as if the body understood that what was needed had been done. Walter had buried her in the corner of the property she had liked most, a spot near the eastern edge of the farmland, where in summer the wildflowers came in waves and the view was long and clear. He had kept farming. He had kept going to the property taxes office every year. He had kept the 40-year document, the original purchase deed, and the engineering analysis he had prepared, in a fireproof filing box under the desk in his office, which was the room that had been the guest room when their children visited, and that he had converted, after Margaret died, into the place where he kept the things that mattered. He was 73 years old. He was not stuck. He was waiting. When Julian Marsh left his business card on the kitchen table and drove back to Columbus, Walter had sat for a while with his coffee. He had known this was coming. Not this specifically, not this particular man in this particular suit, but the conversation, the offer, the moment when the patience of 40 years arrived at a door. He had thought, not this offer, not this way. He had also thought, with a specificity that he had been refining for several years, I need Thomas. Thomas Park was 80 years old and still the most useful brain in any room he entered. He had retired from a distinguished career in urban planning. He had ended up at the national level, advising on federal infrastructure policy, which was exactly what you would have predicted if you had known him at a library table in Columbus in 1968. Walter called him. Thomas answered on the second ring. The development consortium made contact, Walter said. Which firm? Thomas said. Someone named Julian Marsh, Marsh Properties. A pause. I know the name, Thomas said. Aggressive, good at what he does, underestimates people he categorizes as unsophisticated. He thought the wetland was a liability, Walter said. A pause. Thomas said, he offered you below assessed value. Significantly below, Walter said. Thomas said, good, we are on schedule. Julian waited 2 weeks. He had done this calculation before, give the seller time to sit with the offer and to feel the weight of what they might be missing. Let the deadline work for you. People who did not call you back were not refusing, they were thinking. He called Walter on a Thursday morning. Walter answered. Julian said, Mr. Bream, Julian Marsh, I wanted to follow up on our conversation and see if you had any questions about the offer. Walter said, I do not have questions about the offer, Mr. Marsh. Julian said, the timeline I mentioned, 90 days, we are now at 78. I wanted to make sure you were aware that the window is narrowing. Walter said, I appreciate that. Julian said, is there a figure that would make this work for you? I have some flexibility on the number I showed you. Walter said, the number is not the issue, Mr. Marsh. Julian said, what is the issue? Walter said, I am still thinking. Julian said, Of course, take your time. He hung up. He said to Greg, He is playing for more money. That is fine. I will give him more money. We can still land this within the project budget. Greg said, Or he does not want to sell. Julian said, He is a 73-year-old farmer sitting on land that is worth 20 times what he paid for it. He will sell. Greg said, How do you know? Because everyone sells, Julian said. Greg looked at him. He did not argue. He had learned that arguing with Julian's certainties was a specific kind of patience that he could not always sustain. Julian drove back out to Milford Township the following Tuesday. He had decided that a second in-person visit would be more effective than phone calls. He had also decided to bring a revised offer 12% above the first figure, enough movement to signal seriousness without indicating desperation. He parked on the county road outside the property. He was about to get out of his car when another vehicle appeared from the opposite direction. Not a farm truck, not a county vehicle. A black Mercedes S-Class, current model, with a driver. Julian watched it slow and turn into Walter Bream's driveway. He sat very still in his own car. The driver got out. He went to the passenger side and opened the rear door. He reached in and removed a thermos, the kind of high-end insulated thermos that Julian had seen in corporate hospitality situations, and a leather folder. He walked to the front door. Walter Bream opened it before the driver knocked. The driver handed Walter the thermos and the folder. He said something. Walter said something. The driver nodded and went back to the car. The Mercedes sat in the driveway. Walter went inside. Julian sat on the county road for 45 seconds. He was trying to place what he had just seen. His immediate reading was, someone else is making an offer. There is competition he had not known about. His second reading, arriving right after. If someone in a black Mercedes is sending a driver with a folder to this property, the property is worth more than Julian's assessment. He did not have a third reading yet. He got out of his car. He walked up the driveway. The driver was leaning against the Mercedes, looking at his phone. He glanced up at Julian. He said nothing. Julian said, "Who are you with?" The driver looked at him with the specific blankness of someone who had been asked this kind of question before and had prepared for it. "I'm just a driver," the driver said. Julian knocked on the door. Walter opened it. He saw Julian. Something moved across Walter's face. Not surprise, not the inconvenience of an unwanted visitor. Something that in a different person Julian might have identified as amusement. He said, "Mr. Marsh, come in." At the kitchen table, the folder from the driver was to one side. Julian could see it was thick and contained documents. He could not see the header. Walter poured coffee without asking. Julian placed the revised offer on the table. Walter picked it up and read it. He said, "You've increased the offer." "Yes," Julian said, 12%. Walter put it down. He said, "Mr. Marsh, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course," Julian said. "Do you understand what the wetland is for?" Julian had been asked a variation of this question before. He had his answer ready. "The wetland has environmental designation," he said. "We would work with the relevant agencies on mitigation strategies. These projects always find solutions to protected land." "That is not what I am asking," Walter said. Julian looked at him. Walter said, "I am asking if you understand specifically what the wetland does, what its function is, in the context of the development you are trying to assemble." Julian said, "It is a natural drainage feature." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Natural drainage feature," he repeated, carefully, without expression. "Yes," Julian said. Walter looked at him. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I was a civil engineer for 22 years. I worked for the Ohio Department of Transportation. My primary specialization was infrastructure and water systems." He paused. "I know exactly what that wetland is. I bought this land 41 years ago specifically because I knew what it was. The wetland is not a drainage feature. It is the only viable natural filtration system in the eastern corridor within the footprint required by federal stormwater management regulations for a development the size of Meridian's project. Without it, the project cannot receive environmental permits. Julian held very still. He was processing. Walter continued, calmly, with the measured pace of someone who had thought through this explanation many times. I have been aware of the Meridian project's planning for 9 months, Walter said. My former colleague Thomas Park, he advised on federal infrastructure policy for 30 years, flagged it to me when the first planning documents became accessible. I have had legal counsel reviewing the situation since then. The folder that arrived this morning contains the finalized analysis from that review. Julian looked at the folder. He looked at Walter. He said, "You knew." "I have known since 1982, Walter said. When I was looking at the ODOT's long-range infrastructure projections and understood where the Eastern Corridor was going to develop. I bought this land in 1983. Julian said nothing. "I was not going to sell for below assessed value," Walter said. "I am not going to sell for 12% above assessed value. The wetland is not a liability, Mr. Marsh. It is the mechanism without which the project does not exist." Julian left the farmhouse 20 minutes later. He sat in his car. He called Greg. "The farmer is a retired civil engineer," he said. "He bought the land 40 years ago because he knew the development was coming. He understands the wetland's regulatory function. He has legal counsel. He has connections at the federal level." Silence on the other end. Greg said, "What are we going to do?" Julian said, "We are going to find another way." He thought for a moment. Then he said, "What if we buy everything else? All 11 other parcels. Get full control of the district except for this piece. Then Meridian has everything they need except one part, the part that is surrounded by what we own. What leverage does a swamp have when it is landlocked by our holdings?" Greg said, "I am not sure that is." "Get me the full district map," Julian said. "I want to know what the total acquisition costs look like if we buy all 11 other parcels directly." Greg said, "Julian, please think about this carefully." "Get me the map," Julian said. "If this story is landing, subscribe. The best part is still coming." Julian moved fast. He always moved fast when he was confident. In the 2 weeks after the second visit to Walter Bream's farmhouse, he assembled the acquisition of the 11 other parcels with a speed that impressed his team and alarmed Greg. He used a combination of Marsh Properties' own capital and a bridge loan that he had arranged through a business banking relationship he had cultivated for years. The total acquisition cost for the 11 parcels was substantial. It was the largest single outlay Julian had ever made. He made it without hesitation. His reasoning was straightforward. The 11 parcels, combined, represented effective control of the district. Meridian Group needed the entire zone to proceed. If Julian held 11 of 12 parcels, Meridian would have to negotiate through him. His leverage would be total. Even if Walter Bream held out on his parcel, the surrounding control meant that Julian could effectively dictate terms to everyone. He was going to own the district. He told Greg, "Think about where we are. We hold the approach, the site, the perimeter. The only thing we don't hold is 340 acres in the middle." Greg said, "You're assuming the middle doesn't have leverage that doesn't depend on being surrounded." Julian said, "What leverage does an island have?" Greg said, "An island that produces the oxygen everyone breathes has considerable leverage." Julian said, "That is an analogy, Greg. This is a wetland." He completed the acquisitions. He scheduled a press event. He had done press events before, but nothing at this scale. The Meridian deal, once he controlled the full district, was the kind of deal that got coverage, that established your firm as a player at the level he had been building toward for 15 years. He booked the conference room on the 23rd floor. He invited the 2 news stations. He arranged for the Meridian Group's representative to be present, a man named Bradley from their development team who was, at this stage, cautiously positive about Julian's position, but had specific reservations he had not yet articulated clearly. Greg had noted Bradley's caution. Julian had not. He arranged the chair at the head of the table. He placed the signing documents in front of it. He thought, Walter Bream is going to spend the rest of his life driving a tractor around a swamp that is surrounded by a district. He was offered a stake in and refused. He thought, this is how it ends for people who do not understand what they have. He did not think about Greg's question. He did not think about what leverage an island might have that did not depend on being surrounded. He had not, in the weeks of rapid acquisition, read one specific document carefully. He had read it. His eyes had passed over it. His legal team had flagged it and sent a summary. The summary had described it as a historical access easement of limited current commercial relevance. He had read the summary. He had not read the full document. The full document was a deed restriction and access easement that had been registered in 1947, before either Julian or Walter was born. It covered the only paved road leading into the development district, a county road that ran from the main highway through the farmland before entering the project zone. The road had been created in 1947 by the landowner who had owned the entire tract before it was parceled. That landowner had, at the time, recorded a covenant in the deed that gave the holder of the Bream parcel, the western portion, the farmland and wetland, permanent access rights over the county road in exchange for allowing the road to be built across a corner of what was then a single unified property. The access easement ran with the land. It was Walter Bream's. It had been for 41 years. What it meant, in the most direct legal language available, was this. The only road into the development district required Walter Bream's permission to use for commercial purposes above a specific threshold. The threshold had been set in 1947 for agricultural and residential use and had not been updated. A district-scale commercial development, with the traffic volumes and commercial activity the Meridian project entailed, exceeded that threshold by an order of magnitude. Without Walter Bream's agreement, the road could not be used for the project. Without the road, there was no access to the district. Without access, Julian's 11 parcels were, in the precise legal and practical sense, an island. Walter had known about the easement since 1983. It was in his filing box. He had mentioned it to Thomas Park in their first conversation 9 months ago. Thomas had said, "Does the Marsh Properties team know about it?" Walter had said, "I have no idea what they know." Thomas had said, "We'll find out." They had found out on a Tuesday morning when Julian Marsh was sitting at the head of a table, in a conference room with cameras pointed at him and a pen in his hand. The door opened. Walter Bream walked in. He was in his flannel shirt. He was in his mud-caked boots. He had driven from Milford Township that morning, and he had walked through the lobby of Columbus's most expensive office building in his work clothes, and nobody had stopped him, because the woman at the front desk had looked at his face and decided, correctly, that this was not a man who would be stopped by a lobby. Beside him was Thomas Park, 80 years old, in a suit that was significantly better than Julian's. Behind them was a woman who Julian would later learn was a federal environmental compliance attorney. Behind her was their legal team. Walter walked to the head of the table. He stopped. He looked at Julian. He said, "I'm afraid that's my chair you're sitting in." Julian did not move immediately. He held the pen. He looked at Walter. He looked at the cameras. He looked at Bradley from Meridian Group, who had gone very still and whose face was showing the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for this and has not said so. Julian said, "Mr. Bream." Walter said, "Mr. Marsh." "This is a private event," Julian said. "Is it?" Walter said. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the news journalists. "There appear to be journalists here." Julian said, "They are here for the signing." I see, Walter said. He sat down in the chair to Julian's left, not confrontationally, just calmly. Thomas Park took the chair to the right. Walter opened the folder he was carrying. He placed a document on the table. He slid it toward Julian. Julian looked at it. He picked it up. He read the first page. He stopped. He read it again. Then he set it down and looked at Walter. The access easement, he said. His voice was very flat. Yes, Walter said. You own the access rights to the county road, Julian said. Yes, Walter said. Since 1983, it came with the property. The covenant was in the original deed. Julian looked at Bradley. Bradley said, quietly, My team has been aware of the easement for 3 weeks, Julian. We flagged it in the due diligence summary. Julian looked at Greg, who was standing near the window. Greg said nothing. His expression said everything. Julian looked at the document again. He said, What does this mean for the development? Walter said, The county road is the only paved access to the project zone. A development the scale and traffic volume of the Meridian project requires commercial access rights above the threshold set in the original covenant. The covenant specifies that commercial access above that threshold requires written agreement from the holder of the western parcel. That is me. Julian said, So without your agreement? The development cannot use the road, Walter said. And without the road, the district is inaccessible for commercial development. Julian looked at his 11 parcels on the map in front of him. He understood now what Greg had been trying to say. An island. Not because it was surrounded. Because the only way in required permission from the thing in the middle. The room was very quiet. The cameras were still running. Julian put the pen down. He said, What do you want? Walter looked at him. He said, What I want is not what you think it is. He reached into the folder and pulled out a second document. He placed it on the table. He said, This is a proposal, not an offer to sell, a proposal for a partnership structure. Julian looked at the document. Walter continued, The wetland is not going to be developed. It is going to be maintained as the environmental filtration system the Meridian project requires. The federal regulations are clear, and my attorney has already had preliminary conversations with the Environmental Compliance Office. The wetland will be deeded into a conservation trust that I established last year. It will function as required for the project's environmental permits, and it will be protected permanently. Julian said, And the access road? I will grant the commercial access rights, Walter said, in exchange for 3 things. Julian waited. First, Walter said, the district development must include, as a minimum, 20% affordable residential units at pricing accessible to the median Columbus household income. This is not negotiable, and it will be a deed covenant on the commercial access agreement. Julian looked at Bradley. Bradley was writing. Second, Walter said, a community center, properly funded, properly staffed, with programming for the families who will live in the affordable units, will be built as part of the first phase of development, not as an afterthought in Phase 4. Julian said, That is a significant cost. Yes, Walter said, it is. Julian looked at the cameras. He looked at the journalists. He understood that the optics of arguing with an old farmer about affordable housing in a room full of cameras were not favorable. He said, What is the third condition? Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder in front of him. He said, The third condition is personal. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small piece of paper. He placed it on the table. Julian looked at it. It was a photograph. 2 people, young, at a public works information meeting sometime in the mid-1970s. A man and a woman, both looking at each other with the specific quality of people who have just discovered that the person they are talking to speaks the same language they thought they were alone in. Walter said, The community center will be named after my wife, Margaret. She was at my side for every part of this. The land was in both our names since 1983. She believed in this plan because she believed in me and because she understood what it was for. She died 4 years ago and she did not see this part, but the center will be named for her." The room was completely quiet. Julian looked at the photograph. He looked at Walter. He said, "You have been planning this for 40 years. 41, Walter said. "With your wife," Julian said. "Yes," Walter said. Julian was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Why did you not approach Meridian directly? You had the leverage. You could have set your terms from the beginning." Walter looked at him. He said, "I needed to know what the project would be in the hands of the people who were assembling it. If you had come to me with a project that included affordable housing and community infrastructure, we would have had a different conversation from the beginning. What you came to me with was a premium development for the highest market tier with no provision for the community that was already there." Julian was quiet. "I also needed to know," Walter said, "how you would treat someone you assessed as beneath consideration." He said it without heat. He did not look at Julian when he said it. But the meaning was in the air. Julian heard it. He thought about the suit. He thought about the word he used in his head, stuck, and the confidence with which he had applied it to a man who had been calmly, patiently, completely outmaneuvered him across a 40-year horizon. He thought about Greg saying, "Be careful." He thought about the way he had driven back from the first visit and said on the phone, "He is simple." He had not been right. He had not been close to right. He had looked at mud-caked boots and flannel and 73 years of a man's life, and he had seen nothing. He said, "I owe you an apology." Walter looked at him. "Specifically," Walter said. Julian said, "On the first visit, I told you the wetland had no utility. I said you were probably unaware of your land's full value. I implied you were not sophisticated enough to understand your own situation." Walter said, "Yes, you did." "I was wrong," Julian said, "on every part of it." Walter said, "Yes, you were." The journalists were still writing. Julian picked up the pen. He looked at the proposal document Walter had placed on the table. He said, "If I agree to your 3 conditions, the affordable housing percentage, the community center, and the nomming, you will grant the access rights and the project can proceed." "With one addition," Walter said. "I want a seat on the Development Oversight Board, a non-voting advisory seat. I am not going to run the project, but I want to be present when decisions are made that affect what this district becomes." Julian looked at Bradley. Bradley nodded, once without hesitation. Julian signed the agreement. He signed his own documents after. The event that had been set up for the signing of Julian's district acquisition proceeded. He signed. But the document that the cameras were interested in, the document that the journalists asked about afterward in the hallway, was Walter Bream's. Because someone on Julian's team had mentioned to one of the journalists, before the old man walked in, that this was a straightforward signing. And now it was not straightforward. It was the story of a 73-year-old farmer who had been mocked at a kitchen table 2 months ago and had walked into a glass boardroom in his work boots and changed every condition of the deal. The journalists found this interesting. Julian spent 20 minutes in the hallway after the meeting answering questions that he had not prepared for. Later in the car driving home, Greg said, "For what it is worth, he was not simple." Julian looked out the window. "No," he said. "He was the most prepared person in that room. He has been the most prepared person in that room since 1983. Greg said, "The margin on this project is going to be lower than you projected." "I know," Julian said. "The affordable housing requirement and the community center." "I know," Julian said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are they wrong conditions?" Greg looked at him. "No," Greg said, "they are not wrong conditions." Julian looked at Columbus passing the window. 20% affordable housing, he said, in a district that is going to be the most significant development in this city in 30 years. That is, that is actually a significant thing. Greg said nothing. The community center, Julian said, named for his wife. Greg said, 41 years of planning, that is extraordinary. Julian was quiet. Then he said, I am going to personally make sure the community center is built in phase 1, not phase 4, phase 1. Greg looked at him. Yes, he said, good. The Margaret Bream Community Center opened 2 years later. Walter had attended every planning meeting from his advisory seat. He had said almost nothing in most of them. He was not there to run the process. But 3 times, in 3 different planning meetings, he had said something specific and accurate that had changed a decision. The 3rd time, the project architect, a woman named Diana who had been skeptical of the advisory seat arrangement at first, had looked at Walter after he finished speaking and said, How did you know that? Walter had said, I have been watching this kind of thing for 50 years. Diana had said, You should have been an architect. Walter said, I was an engineer, close enough. Julian attended the community center opening. He had not been invited specifically. It was a public event. He came because he wanted to be there. He stood at the back of the crowd. He watched Walter stand at the front, beside the woman who ran the center's programs, a community organizer who had worked in Columbus neighborhoods for 20 years and who Walter had been involved in hearing. Julian heard Walter speak. Walter said, Margaret would have told me I was being too patient. She was the one who understood that plans have to eventually become things. She would have been here today to see this thing. He paused. He said, she would have had a better speech prepared. The people who knew the story laughed. Julian at the back did not laugh. He felt something that he did not have a ready name for. He thought about the kitchen table in Milford Township, the coffee Walter had poured without asking, the calendar on the wall, the way Walter had said have a safe drive in a tone that was not hostile, but was also not what Julian had thought it was. He thought, I looked at that man and I was wrong in every particular. He thought, Greg has been trying to tell me this for years. He thought about the people who were going to live in the affordable housing units, about the children who were going to use the community center, about a wetland that was going to filter water for a city district for the next century because a man had read blueprints in 1982 and understood what the land was for before anyone else did. He thought, this is what is on the other side of patience. He stayed until the end of the event. He did not speak to Walter. He drove home. He sat at his desk and he opened a notebook. He had never kept a notebook, but he opened one now. He wrote one sentence. He wrote, ask what I do not know before assuming I know everything. He looked at it. He added, specifically, ask what the person across the table knows that I have not learned yet. He closed the notebook. He put it in his desk drawer. It was the beginning of something, small but real. Walter went back to the farm after the opening. He drove the county road, his county road, the one that was going to carry the traffic of a whole district's development because he had said yes, and he pulled into his driveway. He sat in the truck for a moment. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the eastern edge of the property where Margaret was buried, where in summer the wildflowers came in waves. He said to the window to the afternoon, it worked. He thought about what she would have said. He thought she would have said, of course it worked. He thought she would have said, now what are you going to do with yourself? He smiled. He got out of the truck. He went inside. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where a man in a $1,200 suit had sat and told him his wetland was a drainage feature and his life's work was worth below assessed value. He looked at the kitchen. He thought 41 years was the right amount of time. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the land that had always been worth exactly what he knew it was worth. He drank his coffee. He was home. So that is Walter and Julian. That is what 41 years of knowing exactly what you have looks like when the moment finally arrives. But let me stay with you for a moment before we go. Because this story is about patience, and I want to say something about patience that is different from the usual thing people say about it. Patience is not waiting. Patience is knowing. Walter did not spend 41 years on that farm hopping things would work out. He spent 41 years knowing what was coming and being the person it was coming to find. That is different. Hopping is passive. Knowing is active. He maintained the land. He paid the taxes. He filed the documents. He had conversations with Thomas Park and built his legal position and understood the regulatory framework. He did the work of someone who was not waiting for an opportunity, but was preparing to receive what he had already identified. That is what made the mud-caked boots possible. He could afford to walk into that boardroom in his work clothes because he knew what was in the folder under his arm. He did not need the shoes to tell the room who he was. The folder told the room. There is also something in this story about what Julian did after. He signed the agreement. He sat in a car on the way home and said the right things. And then he attended the community center opening. And then he sat at his desk and wrote 2 sentences in a notebook. That is not redemption. That is the beginning of something smaller and more real than redemption. It is the beginning of a person deciding to be different in specific and practical ways. He did not become Walter overnight. He did not become Walter at all, but he opened the notebook, and the notebook is the thing. Because Julian was not born arrogant. He was born in a 62-degree house in Akron with a father who worked 31 years at a paper mill and a boy who looked at the ceiling and decided it was a problem. That energy, the specific energy of a boy who refuses to accept the ceiling, is real, and it produced something real. The firm, the deals, 15 years of genuine work. It also produced the word he used in his head for people he categorized as stuck. And the story of how he encountered the person who was the most opposite of stuck that he had ever met, sitting on 41 years of patient and complete preparation, is the story of what happened when that word met its specific correction. He received the correction. He is going to carry it. That is the full ending. And then there is Margaret. She is not in most of this story. She is in all of this story. She sat at a kitchen table in 1983 and said, "This is either the smartest thing you have ever done, or we are going to be very embarrassed in 40 years. And then she picked up the pen. She put her name on the deed. She came to the farm. She chose the eastern corner, where the wildflowers grew. She asked good questions in planning meetings for 22 years. She said, "The infrastructure is coming, is it not?" It was not a question. She already knew. She and Walter were the same in the specific way. They saw what was real before it was visible to anyone else. She just did not live to stand in the boardroom in the mud-caked boots. But her name is on the building. That is not a small thing. That is 41 years of belief and patience, and picking up the pen when it mattered, turned into something permanent. The Margaret Bream Community Center. She would have had a better speech prepared. She would have said something true, and something funny, and something that landed correctly. She always did. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button. Right now, 1 tap. Subscribe to Fair Folktales and ring the notification bell. We are here every week with stories like this. Stories about people who were underestimated. Stories about patience that became buildings. Stories about what happens when the person you dismissed walks into the room in their work clothes and says, "That is my chair." Share this with someone who has been told their thing is worthless. Someone who has been sitting on a plan for years and has not been believed. Let them know patience is not waiting. Patience is knowing. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who later had to change their entire understanding of you? Tell us the full story. We read every single one. This is Fair Folktales. The greedy always fall. The overlooked always rise. And the ones who knew all along, they were always going to walk into the room. They just chose the right moment to do it. We will see you in the next story.